Good afternoon. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. And first of all, thank you so much to NACD Northern California for hosting this regular LGBTQ plus cohort. It means a lot. My name is Fabrice Houdart, and I'm the head of the Association of LGBTQ plus Corporate Directors, whose mission is to improve representation of LGBTQ plus people in the boardroom. Since the last time that Lisa brought us together, a lot has changed in general, but a lot has changed also specifically on board diversity, and we will have the opportunity to discuss this. I'm very happy that our panel represents, many aspects, right? Beth represents the legal aspect, and Vanessa represents the human aspect, and Jim represents the lived experience of being an out CEO in this changing context. So I think before we jump into the questions, I would love to maybe have each of our panelists introduce themselves, and maybe we can start with you, Beth.
Sure, happy to. Hi, I'm Beth Sasfai. I'm a partner at Cooley. I lead our corporate governance and ESG practice. I spend a lot of time working with companies and boards about governance issues. In particular, right now, diversity is a hot topic, both board diversity and workforce diversity, given kind of the current climate here in the US. Prior to coming to Cooley, I spent about 20 years at Verizon leading their governance policy, and I was their lead ESG officer there.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you, Beth. Jim?
Hi, everyone. My name is Jim McCoy. I'm the CEO of Atlas. Atlas is an employer of record company, so we employ people in 160 countries on behalf of organizations that don't have legal entities to do so themselves. But I myself come from about 20 years of experience in the human capital space, running large global organizations. And so this topic is very near and dear to my heart, particularly how do you create the best work environment for all people in your organization?
Thanks, Jim. And Vanessa?
Hi, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Lisa, for hosting this and for having me here. I'm Vanessa Ruda. I'm a senior partner at RHR International. We're a consulting firm of organizational psychologists, and so we focus on that space between human psychology and what we know it to be true about what helps people work in their best and what makes people tick and how that coincides with the business environment that they're in. Personally, I do a lot of work with boards on board diversity, board effectiveness, as well as working with senior management teams. Our goal being to help all of our clients attract the best talent, develop that talent, both individually as well as collectively as part of boards and senior management teams.
Well, thank you so much. And I would like to really thank Cooley and RHR International for sponsoring this session. It's also very nice to see a lot of our friends in the audience today. And I wanted to encourage you to post a question. I mean, there must be a way to do this because we plan to devote a big part of this session to Q&A. So please don't hesitate to put question in the chat, and I'll check it. So Beth, I'll start the conversation with you. It feels like a lot is happening in the past few weeks. I have developed a horrible habit, which is that I'll go on X and look at Elon Musk's thread right before going to bed. But so I have a lot of information, but really there has been a huge amount of development on board diversity. And sometimes, given the amount of noise that there is, it's a bit difficult to know exactly what has happened. So would you mind maybe starting by summarizing what are the regulatory changes and the legal changes and also the rhetoric changes that have kind of changed the map of the board diversity conversation?
Sure, I'm happy to do that. I will tell you, it's been hard to do client alerts because every time we put one out, we have to amend it because the next day something else happens. So yeah, there's been a lot happening in this space. I think one of the first things that probably folks noticed, right, was earlier this year, the NASDAQ board diversity rule was rolled back. So the Fifth Circuit found in a very close vote, a 9-8 vote, that the SEC had exceeded its authority when it approved the NASDAQ board diversity rule. And as you remember, there were a couple of parts of the rule, but one of the parts of that rule required listed companies to publish a pretty granular board diversity matrix that talked about data relating to a company's board of directors, self-identified gender, race, and LGBTQ. And there was also a component that required most listed companies, to have at least 2 diverse directors on their board, 1 woman and 1 underrepresented minority or LGBTQ director. So that had gone kind of a long way towards, in particular, enhancing disclosure. And NASDAQ decided not to appeal that ruling and instead removed the requirement from its rules. So that was kind of one of the first real developments here. And then in February of this year, in response to a lot of what has been going on more broadly in connection with DEI, in particular the executive orders and some other things that the Trump administration has come out with, Goldman Sachs ended its diversity rule. It had, for about 4 years, had a diversity policy that called for the bank to only take public companies if they had 2 diverse board members, one of whom was a woman. And Goldman, when they made this announcement, stated that the change was a result of legal developments in the space, but was kind of forthright and said, the bank continues to believe that successful boards benefit from diverse backgrounds and perspectives, but nonetheless got rid of their rule. And as we head into proxy season, the proxy advisors have also made changes to their rules, as have some of the investors. ISS is no longer considering gender and racial or ethnic diversity of a company's board when making voting recommendations. They've put that on hold. Glass Lewis is continuing to stick to its policies. However, it came out with a note this week that said, we're going to flag for you any sort of negative diversity related direct recommendation, so that if your preference is to ignore that, we'll give you some rationale for ignoring that. So they're trying to kind of walk a fine line there as well. And there's also, other developments outside of kind of the proxy arena that are touching on board diversity. There are a number of investigations that have been launched in connection with some of the executive orders. In particular, the FCC has been kind of charging ahead with investigations of Comcast and Verizon that encompass kind of all areas of diversity, both in the workforce and at the board level. And then the state attorney generals have also started with some legal activity. The state attorney general for Missouri recently filed a DEI lawsuit against Starbucks. And while it was largely about workforce diversity, one of the counts did focus on board diversity and, of course, cited to proxy disclosures that Starbucks had, which a lot of companies have, right, about valuing overall diversity, a variety of opinions, perspectives, backgrounds, gender, race, not unusual language in a proxy statement. And Starbucks also had, a requirement that they would require their search firms to have a diverse slate. And so that litigation is ongoing. So there's been just a lot of activity in the space, such that boards and management teams have been having a lot of discussions about where they stand and what their risk tolerance is.
Well, I love how you summarize it. What is kind of crazy is that all of this happened in a matter of a few weeks.
Yeah.
And also, frankly, what you highlight too is that the bar was not super high to start with, right? The bar at Goldman was not super high to start with, but now even that low bar is considered to be problematic, and so that's a bit of a cold shower on the board diversity agenda. I mean, it's probably a euphemism to call it a cold shower. But then what you also point out is that independently of those regulatory and legal changes, there's also the discussion, right? And I'm going to come to you, Jim, because you have a board. I think we can assume that pretty much every board in America must have had a discussion on what does the pushback on DEI, let alone the board diversity agenda, means for us. So can you tell us a little bit, how did that conversation go? You know, is it weird? Is it awkward as a CEO? You know, how do you navigate a discussion like that?
Fabrice, it's a great question. And in the case of my board, I have a board that's been very supportive of diversity throughout the organization. And in particular, because we support individuals in 160 different countries with a variety of regulatory regimes, it's really critical for us to respect diversity in all of its flavors. So specifically, when I talk to my board about diversity initiatives, what they're looking for me to do is, one, attract the best talent, two, to provide an optimal environment so that people are set up to succeed in our environment. And then three, creating a sense of psychological safety so that if someone sees something, they say something. And the way we think about this in the context of diversity is that if we're not creating an environment where people feel safe, we're never going to be able to accomplish those three objectives. And so I view every single day, every interaction I have with my employees, every interaction I have with my board, every interaction I have with my clients and my stakeholders, an opportunity to reconfirm our commitment to those three critical aspects. Whether you call it diversity or good management, it's really all about the same thing. For my board, one of the things my board understands is because of the pace of change in the last 6 weeks, we now have many people, particularly our trans colleagues, our non-binary colleagues, who don't frankly feel safe in their communities. And so the onus is on us as leaders to create that safe space for them, at least when they're at work. And so that is an expectation that my board has of me. And it's something that I take very seriously. I talk about it publicly, but I also talk about it in the confines of our town halls and individual meetings with people in my organization about how critical this is to all of us.
Yeah, well, you know, that's very encouraging, Jim. You know, I wish every company had the same type of discussion. You know, what you and I discussed too is that, you know, you're in the business of talent. And that makes it a bit different as if you are kind of not thinking, look, my main asset is my employees and my staff, you know. But I do think that some industries have reacted the way you describe, which is to say, well, look, you know, this is how we succeed, and you know, whatever the environment is, human capital is still our priority. Vanessa, I'm going to be a bit blunt with you. You know, independently of this legal shift and this conversation inside the boardroom, you know, the member of the Association of LGBTQ plus Corporate Directors have always had to navigate their identity, right? Meaning that particularly that generation, which is people, you know, that are probably in their mid-50s to mid-70s, right? There has been times where it was extremely dangerous to be out, meaning, you know, it was extremely problematic in business. It can be very tempting for many of them to be like, I'm going to go back in the closet, not in my private life, but I'm going to go back in the closet in my public life, in the public sphere, in business. I'm going to remove references to my LGBT engagement on my LinkedIn and try to go under the radar. You know, what are your thoughts about this? What are your thoughts also about this concept of psychological safety? I know that if a lot of people would say, well, that's another woke agenda over there, but you know, it's true that there is something a bit weird in being told, well, look, LGBT is a bit the same thing as woke equal enemy of the nation, right? So how do you navigate all those things, in your opinion?
It's such a great question, and it is such an unbelievably challenging time in this country for so many reasons. And I want to just echo, Jim, what you've said, because I think you said it so perfectly and eloquently. You know, this is about just creating an environment where people can thrive, where all people can thrive. That's our job. That's your job. That's the goal of all of this. If people can thrive, they're going to do great things, whether they're, you know, trans, straight, male, female, it doesn't matter. You're gonna do good things when you feel safe and when you can thrive. And so I just I really appreciate your perspective, Jim, because I share that perspective. I think, Fabrice, in terms of your question, and it's a very, very challenging one, in that there is a reality right now, unfortunately, where people who once felt safe no longer do. And that's a truth that we may want to wish it away, but it is the reality. And I think we have to be mindful of that. That said, certainly in my practice, I would never encourage someone to say you have to hide who you are. In line with what you were saying, Jim, it's very hard to imagine a world in which someone can thrive if they're hiding who they are. Those things are incompatible for the most part. And so I think where you land is walking this line of recognizing that there is fear, and people come by that fear very honestly, unfortunately. And so I think it's incumbent upon everyone to create a space, hopefully, where people can just show up as who they are. Easier said than done in some circumstances. Jim, it sounds like your board is just incredibly supportive. Unfortunately, not all boards and not all management teams are. But certainly, when we think about what we're encouraging people to do, it is to create that safe space. The other thing I would say, Fabrice, to your question, and it's such a personal decision for so many people, depending on where they are, what organization they're with, how visible, their lives are, et cetera. But something that I think is important for people to think about is, what is the contribution that you want to make to your board, to your organization? What is your value proposition? What do you want to be known for? And whatever that is, to lead with that. It doesn't mean to hide who you are as a person, but to ask yourself the question, what do you want your contribution to be? And to really have an honest answer to that question. And that's the piece that you lead with. So if my contribution is, I'm, a financial guru, or I've got marketing expertise, or whatever it is, that's what you want to lead with. And you want to do so in an environment, hopefully, that creates safety for you to speak your mind and be who you are. But I'd encourage people to think about what is it that they want to be known for in a professional context, in their board, in their management team. Again, not hiding who they are, but thinking about what do they want people to remember them for in terms of their contribution to the work.
I love that. And the truth is that even whether we discuss it at the proxy level or on the individual level, we all have to make some adjustment, right? I mean, it's not the same context than 2 months ago. It's extremely different. And I'll make a little confession in our panel discussion today, which is that we change some of the semantics on our website. And to be honest, it's very rare now that I use the word diversity, right? I've been using the word LGBT excellence, which, by the way, is the title of this seminar, right? And it's kind of, it makes me feel a bit icky, but the reality is that we have to adjust a bit to the context and also to the risk associated with the context. And so, Beth, talking about the risk, I don't want you to give a free consultation here, but, first of all, are clients coming to you asking you to review their website, their proxy, their programs? And second of all, in fact, Cassie Halligan just put a link to an HBR article that talks about how to speak about communicating about DI. Do you have any recommendation? And also, what are you observing with your clients? Are your clients really in panic mode, or are they more being like, well, can you glance over our programs and tell us how to talk about it?
So this is all I've talked about for the last month. And I think one of the things I've really come away with is there is just not a one size fits all here, but it is so important to make sure that everyone is having the right conversations and that they're aligned around risk, what their messaging is going to be, and how they're going to move forward. And part of that is slowing things down just a little bit, right? So I think, when you see kind of one of these announcements comes out, I'm going to get 1 million calls, and the immediate reaction is, what do we need to do? And the what do we need to do is take a breath, right? Always. And not overcorrect and not dig in, but like sit and look, where are we? And so, one of the first things that we do, which you mentioned, Fabrice, is, let's look and make sure we understand, what do you have? What are your programs? How are you talking about these initiatives? What kind of disclosures do you have? And also understanding who are your stakeholders, right? What's your employee population like? What's your risk profile like? Who are your customers? Are your investors? Are these issues important to them? And really thinking about kind of the different stakeholders and the different reactions that folks will have, understanding that you're not going to be able to please everybody, but being thoughtful there, and also understanding your risk profile. Am I a federal government contractor? Am I a company that is, you know, in an industry that is likely a focus of the Trump administration, DOJ? Do I need a particular license? Do I have a merger pending? All of these things need to be kind of taken into consideration. Not that they're going to change your values or what you stand for, but they may change the way you're going to talk about them. And the other thing that we work with clients a lot on is making sure that they are describing lawful initiatives and programs lawfully, because I think one of the things we've realized is, you know, often when you're talking about, for example, recruiting or hiring, I think sometimes the way we may talk about those efforts can sound more like a quota when it is not at all in practice. And so we've also worked with clients on kind of scrubbing messaging to actually reflect what they do and on their own terms. And we also are really pulling people away from acronyms. DEI means a lot of different things to a lot of people. It actually doesn't say anything about what you're doing. I think you really need to, on your own terms, define what your focus is, that you're focused on bringing your whole self to work, inclusive environments, whatever it is that is kind of the baseline of your culture. You know, you got to choose your own words. And in some ways, I will say, I think that's great for companies, because I think using acronyms, sometimes you're really not that thoughtful about what something really means to your bottom line and what it means to your culture. So I've seen some good things come out of this too. I've seen clients get much better with their messaging.
Well, look, I'm an ESL, but I think the expression is don't give them the stick to beat you with, or there's some expression like that, which I completely understand. I don't want to bring my own anxiety into our conversation, but Beth, my fear is that it might be very tempting for people to just remove all reference to sexual orientation, LGBTQ+, gender identity, you know, randomly everywhere they find it, in their staff manual, you know what I mean? That's one of my fears, is that it might be tempting to be like, I'm just going to remove it just in case it is problematic. Do you think that's a risk?
I think it's a risk. I think some companies will do that. It really, frankly, depends, I think, on how ingrained and intertwined some of these values and concepts are to your company. I mean, I have clients who for 20 years have had like a focus on workforce diversity and inclusion. They're not just throwing every term out overnight. I have other clients who, you know, for what I would describe as more marketing reasons, adopted kind of various kinds of statements. And for them, they're jettisoning them. They didn't mean a lot to them to begin with, right? So that's an issue. Another issue, though, is even just replacing language, taking things out, but let's say take everything out and you're continuing to operate BAU. If you look at the recent Comcast investigation by the FCC, they've asked them for every single change they've made, regardless of what it's called, and if you're operating it under a new name. So that's really not going to, I don't think, be particularly helpful to certain companies anyway. And so I think part of it is understanding, again, how to put your affirmative, lawful message forward so that you can kind of, you know, dig in there rather than just kind of hiding. Sometimes hiding is not going to be remotely helpful. And some companies, Fabrice, are going to be incredibly risk averse, and that's just going to be the unfortunate result.
I'll ask you one last question. I don't want to annoy you too much, but do you think there could be a context in which having an employee resource group is illegal? You know, most companies have an employee resource group, right? Whether it's a women's group or an LGBTQ plus group, you know, big companies tend to have this group, right? It's about socializing, networking, career opportunities. Is there a way in which someone within the company could complain and say this group is discriminatory? The existence of this group is discriminatory.
So certainly someone can say that. I think what we've advised our clients is making sure that those groups are open to everyone, making that very clear, right, is a good defense there. You know, one thing I will say, and I'm glad you brought this up, that is extremely frustrating about the executive orders is from a federal government contractor perspective, there's an incentive for employees to complain, right? So one of the mechanisms in the executive order is that a federal government contractor has to make a certification about having only lawful DEI programs, and it gives the right for the government to bring something called a False Claims Act claim. So that's usually based on a whistleblower. And so there will be this incentive for employees to make certain claims for sure. But, you know, again, if you are taking an inventory of your programs and being very thoughtful about what you say and how you say it and keeping a record there, you know, you may not be able to help that you have a whistleblower or an employee that says this is discriminatory, but you will have a defense.
You know, just in case there's a spy bot, you know, on this panel, I'll just make it clear that the NACD LGBTQ plus cohort and the Association of LGBT Corporate Directors, we love allies, you know, we love allies, and they're most welcome to come. So Jim, you know, we are new friends, you know, I have a little shtick in which very often I talk about the LGBTQ plus superpower in the boardroom, the fact that sometimes LGBTQ plus people will bring their life experience, you know, and that it might lead to more empathy for people that have known adversity. But also sometimes, you know, the argument that having an LGBT person in your board might help you navigate a gigantic demographic change in America. You know, if I have only seen one piece of news that was positive in the past months, is that 1 out of 10 Americans self-identify as LGBTQ+, which is extremely ironic given the current context. So my question to you, Jim, is as a CEO, you have a claim in the boardroom. When you articulate your board value proposition, meaning what you would bring to a board, you know, where do you place your identity? And how do you suggest that our member deal with their aspect of what they bring to the board?
Fabrice, I would say that I probably had not heard Vanessa's advice, but had taken Vanessa's advice, which is I lead with my skills and accomplishments, but I make sure that any group that I'm going to join is aware of my orientation, that they know that I'm a gay person. I'm out. I've been out for 30 years. I embrace that. And to your point, I use that as a point of strength when it comes to having seen a wide range of treatment of different individuals and how I can take that into account in the way I treat and or create a culture within my organization. I think from a board perspective, I think you're absolutely right. There is a certain understanding that LGBTQ plus people come from. Oftentimes they come from places of adversity, perhaps lack of acceptance in school, lack of acceptance by family, lack of acceptance in a community. This is what makes me so anxious about the last 6-8 weeks, which is all of the antipathy toward people who are trans or non-binary. And I want to make sure that I create the best environment for them to be able to thrive too, in addition to everyone else in the organization. And that's not always easy because you're effectively creating lots of, or you have lots of opportunities to step on your foot and do the wrong thing and be viewed to be favoring one group over another. And I think that that's really critical as a board member and also as a board selects a leadership team, that they have people that are adept at managing the various needs of all the constituencies within their organizations. But I think to your point, thinking that, with 10% of the population identifying as LGBTQ plus, you think about the purchasing power of that organization. And if nothing else, there is tremendous value in having an understanding of LGBTQ plus community, how they buy, brand loyalty, all of the things that really are impactful to an organization from a business perspective, as well as impactful to an organization from a culture perspective.
Well, your response is a bit music to my ear, and I completely agree with you. But I think I had read before, and I don't know if this is completely true, but that when a woman is appointed CEO of a Fortune 500 company, the stock suffers. Meaning that the reaction of the market is to say, well, look, this company is becoming woke, right? Or this company is losing sense of its priority. Do you think there is a legitimate fear that a company could be like, I really like this candidate. Jim has done a very good job in his company. He's perfect for what we have, but I might not want to appoint him to the board because part of his bio is that he lives with his husband. I mean, I don't know if that's the case, but part of his bio is that he lives with his husband and their 2 kids in Milwaukee. And I am afraid that the market is going to read it as we are woke, we are, a diversity company. And, do you think that this is an unrealistic fear on my part?
No, because it's happened to me. I know this to be a fact. I was considered for a CEO role for another organization, and it was very clear. The feedback that I got was 110% of all of the criteria that we're looking for in a leader, but there's just a cultural mismatch there. And the only thing that I could put my finger on was that I was gay, but I wanted to make sure that they knew that in the interview process, because I didn't want that to be something that they discovered later and could somehow not live with. So to your point, I felt that experience myself, and that's what I try to root out of our hiring decisions. And I think that's really critical. So as Beth talks about legally, what you can do, you can consider a broad range of candidates, and that while that may be considered diversity, that's not applying a quota. That's simply giving as many people as possible the equal opportunity to be considered for a role. And to me, that's the ultimate goal of meritocracy. So if we're going to talk about meritocracy versus diversity and inclusion, what I would say is that diversity and inclusion activities level the playing field so that more good quality candidates are considered for roles and important roles and leadership roles within organizations and on boards.
Yeah. I love that. And what you said about your experience, is amazing, right? Because very often people are not going to say, I don't want that gay guy on my board. They're going to say, I'm not sure he's a cultural match we are looking for, right? And then the second aspect is that the feeling I have developed in the past 2 months is that the context has changed, but the facts have not changed. Meaning that LGBT people, we know, are underrepresented in the boardroom. And it's not because some people are telling us, well, you've had enough equality, and now we are done with it, that it changes the fact that we're underrepresented. And one of the things that really struck me last year and the year before is when we analyze a disclosure from NASDAQ, what we realize is that LGBT people are doing well in some sectors and are doing incredibly poorly in others. Right, we have 1.6% of board seats in life science. That's not a panacea, but that's better than what we usually have, which is closer to 1%. But we have 0.2% of the board seats in manufacturing. And what I'm really afraid of, Jim, is that what we are going to end up doing is that we are going to courageously continue to be ourselves, and therefore we are going to gravitate towards sectors that welcome us, and we are going to never be in the sectors where we should be, like heavy machinery, right? Where we have a value added maybe on the board, but we're not going because we don't feel they are welcoming for good reasons, and that's a big fear on my part, right? And lately, behind closed doors, this is what I say. I said the context has changed, but the facts have not changed. We don't have equality, but we are told you've had enough equality. So Vanessa, coming back to you on um, on the question of LGBT people in the boardroom. You know, we've talked a little bit about the question of identity, but what about the question of behavior? You know, meaning when you are in the boardroom and you are an LGBT person, you know, how can you find your voice and use your difference in a context that is not super favorable, or maybe in a context where you don't feel extremely at ease. And one of the things that I would love for you to also explore is that is it useful for LGBTQ plus people that are in the boardroom to think about maybe creating mini caucus with other minorities in the boardroom so that they don't feel so isolated in this conversation, right? Meaning, you know, Jim maybe in his board can express his belief about the importance of diversity, but you couldn't imagine a board in which the LGBT person feels very isolated. And they are in that middle of that conversation in DI, and they don't want to be the flag bearer for diversity. So how do you navigate this fear of being perceived as the outlier, the difficult person, the one that is only talking about identity issues, you know? How can you leverage your identity in a strategic manner in this conversation?
It's such a great question, and I think it builds on so much of what both Beth and Jim were saying, that I agree with wholeheartedly. You know, unfortunately, terms like DEI and woke and psychological safety and all these things have kind of been hijacked and bastardized and taken on different meaning. But at the core, the idea of casting a wide net and attracting the best talent to your board, to your organizations, to your management teams, however that talent may identify, by race, gender, ethnicity, whatever it may be, sexual orientation, that at the core, that's what it was intended to do, right? Really was to create meritocracy where the people with the best ideas, best perspective, best skills, et cetera, can come together and you could leverage the diversity of thought, experiences, et cetera. And so unfortunately it has been kind of hijacked. And if we remember the roots of it, regardless of language, and Beth, to your point, I've had a lot of clients that, you know, have just changed the way that they talk about it, but not necessarily how they think or what their values are or what they're trying to accomplish, which is to really have a diverse workforce that feels safe to show up at their best. And so I think to that aim, when we think about a boardroom and an LGBTQ community member in a boardroom and how, you know, how safe or not safe they may feel. You know, again, from a behavior standpoint, I'd advise that person to show up in a way that I would advise anybody to show up, in terms of there's a hard conversation we have to have. You know, we're going down this direction, we've got a blind spot, we're missing, you know, this key perspective or piece of information, or this particular segment of the market, or whatever it may be. And just as I would encourage anyone to be thoughtful, factual, courageous, compassionate, right? All of those things that you want to do when you're trying to raise a tough issue and when you're worried that you might be a lone voice. That's how I would encourage, you know, anybody from the LGBTQ community to show up. You know, if we step back and regardless again of race, gender, sexual orientation, anything else, you know, if you come into a room hair on fire, you know, about whatever the issue is, chances are you're going to get a reaction that is more of a defensive, angry reaction, and that's kind of human nature. Even more so with a spotlight on LGBTQ and minorities. And so I think you've got to be thoughtful. You know, what is it that I'm trying to do? What is the message I'm trying to deliver to this board? What's the piece of information that they might be missing or insensitive to that I have perspective on, that I want to bring to light because it's in the best interest of our organization? And to then be really thoughtful, what's the best way to do that? What do I know about the board? What do I know about people? What do I know about the stakeholders? And I need to be kind of thoughtful and strategic about how I'm going to present an issue and an argument in the same way that, you know, myself as a woman, right? How do I show up in that space? And I need to think for a minute, right? And think about, I don't want to be labeled X, Y, or Z. I want to be effective. And so what do I need to do to be effective? And that's what I would encourage all of us to do. And particularly, again, unfortunately, a community that is in the spotlight for the wrong reasons. To your question, Fabrice, about, kind of building allyship, yes. I mean, I think we're in a world now where we need allyship in so many ways. There are so many people who are being targeted and marginalized and ostracized and are fearful for very good reasons. And we need solidarity and we need allyship for sure. And whether that's other people who represent minority groups or just people who have a natural orientation to say, you know what, we've got to come together. There's enough divisiveness in the world. We're here on this board for a reason. And so let's come together and do good things. Absolutely. And so I would say to anyone who is feeling like the lone person, find people with whom you have connection, whatever that source of connection is. And the connection may not be around sexual orientation or gender or anything else. They may be different from you in that regard, but find people with whom you have connection and leverage that connection to create allyship.
I wish we would spend more time together, Vanessa, because I find you very reassuring. And and I love a lot of what you talk about is courage of your conviction, right? And I think that, and it's a big question for America, is that does courage pay off right now? I think also, in many ways, the way people behave when it's a bit of time of turmoil, people might remember in a few years from now and be like, oh, I was on the board with that person. And even though it was difficult, they reminded us what are the values of the company and why we need to stick to it. And that's why I want them on my board now. But it's difficult sometimes, to imagine that courage is going to pay off when it might come a bit at a cost right now.
And I think, Fabrice, there's also, I think, a big message here for allies, which is it is a frightening world. And I think it's incumbent upon, and allies can be defined in a lot of ways, right? On the one hand, you could look at me and say, I'm a woman. And so I'm, facing my own barriers in certain ways. But there's other ways in which, I don't have some of the targets on my back that, right? You could look at Jim and say he's a white man. And so he doesn't have, some of those issues, but yet he's right. So all of us can, we can float between, are we representing a minority community or a somewhat oppressed community, or are we representing a community with privilege? And so I think as we think about allyship, right, the importance of all of us in our own ways, using our positions and our platforms, whatever they may be, to say, we need to create space where people can be their best. One, because it's the right thing to do, and two, in a more calculated way, it's the right thing for business. If we want to put on that hat, if we want to succeed in a competitive business environment, we need our boards and we need our management teams and we need our employees to show up at their best. And so what can we as allies do to enable that? Because we need that allyship across the board.
Yeah, and it ties to something that Christy wrote in the chat, which is the fact that diverse teams perform better, and we indeed have some evidence, and even the association actually did, a short study in which we look at the NASDAQ company with LGBT board member and the NASDAQ companies that didn't have them. And of course, we found that companies, if you have an LGBT board member on your board, you're more likely to also have a person of color and a woman. And in fact, you're more likely to be performing better. But, Christy, our experience is also that people will dismiss the studies as, being woke, or, very often what is important is what is a label of who has, done the study. And even if it's in the Harvard Business Review, people will have a tendency to dismiss it as woke propaganda, and we live in a world where now some people have said we need white, competent men to be in positions of power, right? And that narrative has been unleashed, which is a bit strange, but is the reality. So Beth, what comes out a lot from the chat is that people have great difficulties understanding what is now illegal and what is legal. And I think that's probably part of the strategy, right? Is to make sure that it's kind of unclear what is legal or illegal. So I know, we talk about a lot of different things, right? Language in the proxy, we talk about, diversity training, we talk about employee resource group, we talk about hiring practices. How do you help your clients figure out if they are in the legal zone, if they are in the illegal zone, if they are creating opportunities to be sued or not, do you have a way to do that?
So it's the point, right? It's exactly the point. The reason these executive orders don't define what is illegal DEI is because if it's vague, companies will pull back more than they need to. So that is 100% by design. So when we work with clients to kind of take an audit of their programs and look at what they are doing in practice, I mean, one of the bright lines that we use and would have used before an executive order is this idea of no groups excluded. So I mentioned that with the employee resource groups. No clear quotas, no clear preferences, no clear special advantages. And so a lot of what we work with clients on is this idea of just where they can expanding kind of the aperture so that something applies to everyone. Also working on messaging where you say, we're going to broaden the pipeline, right, which is lawful. Coupling that with, we want to hire the best team and the best people. These aren't mutually exclusive concepts. And I will say, even the most sophisticated companies often talk about them as separate things. Like we have DEI, and then here's our, I don't understand that. Here's like some meritocracy, like marrying the concepts in the disclosure right there. We want the best people, so we need the best, we need cast a wide net. We want people from, different backgrounds, different experiences, different skill sets. And by the way, we don't hire based on protected characteristics. We hire the best people. And so finding ways to that narrative has gotten lost somewhere along the way. So we have worked with companies on that. I say all of this, right? And just to be clear, when you said, well, yes, you can still be sued and investigated. I think the reading will be quite broad of what may or may not be acceptable. That's what I'm saying. So there's got to be this discussion, especially for companies who may be in the line of fire, who are very, Target as an example. I can think of many examples who are going to be in the limelight. You've got to make sure that you're aligned on how much risk you're willing to take on. And that's where I do think, to your point, Vanessa, the board's an ally to management there. They're going to get the calculus wrong sometimes. You're going to get a whistleblower lawsuit. You're going to get a complaint. And you've got to be confident that everyone is aligned and that they feel confident that their programs are lawful and that they've made some calculated risks. And that's going to differ for every company. But that's why it's so important, I think, for the board, for you as directors to invite those discussions.
I really like that. Thanks, Beth. Jim, I had another question for you, which is about the role of informal networks, right? And you've succeeded in business. Have you ever had the feeling that there were networks you could not really belong to or that were difficult for you to access? And have you found alternative way of building your network? And do you have any suggestion on someone that is, as an example, on this board journey and wants to palliate to the fact that maybe they are not in the country club or the golf club or the vacation spot where board seats are being exchanged, which is often an experience for LGBT people?
You hit the nail on the head when you said golf club. That is of absolutely no interest to me, nor is it something that I'm especially good at. And really, but I recognize that is often a vehicle for business discussion. And so what I look to do is find other ways to relate to people. So that could be through music, that could be through entertainment, that could be through food and wine or travel or other things. So part of what I like to do naturally is get to know someone and their interests. And if it immediately goes to golf, I ask a lot of questions to find out if there's some other place that I might find a way to connect. But I think you're right. There are networks that are often exclusionary, simply based on personal preference. And it's a matter of personal preference. So I think it's incumbent on us to think about other ways that we can approach to figure out some other connections. So not into the golf, but happy to join you afterward for dinner. Or are there other ways that I can connect with you? And you could recognize that while my skills in golf are not great, we could talk about a whole lot of other things. And and you'll often find that people are much more multidimensional than simply a fixation on that particular activity. But I'm always encouraged by one of the things I personally like to do is shy away from events that are necessarily more gender specific. And do things that tend to be more inclusive. So like for me, instead of having a golf outing, I would rent a box for a concert, or maybe do a food tasting or cooking type of engagement, where oftentimes you tend to find more gender diversity in terms of enjoyment of those sorts of activities. And so as I think about it, and I with my marketing partners are always trying to think about other ways that we can engage people that are not golf, not related to a country club, and really, and frankly, that's a part of our industry too. Is our buyers tend to be women. And generally, you don't have no participation. So I've certainly hired women who are golfers and very much enjoy that and that way to connect. But that's not necessarily the norm. And in particular, I would say that's one area. Golf in particular is not especially known for LGBTQ inclusion. But that said, there are lots of things that you could do that are golf adjacent that certainly would create opportunities to network.
I love that. And I think, our members are probably going to have to be a little more intentional in being visible and being, and networking if we are to take a dent in the representation issue we have, given the fact that the regulator is not on our side. I still have a few minutes, Vanessa, and so I'll come to you about, it's slightly off topic, but I think LGBT people have good reason sometimes lately to feel vilified, right? There's a bit of a sense of mockery that, that we are weak, that we are constantly whining and complaining. I have that bad habit of going on Elon Musk Twitter thread, and very often I see that LGBT is synonym with, being, non-realistic and constantly complaining. How can LGBT people in a world where there's a lot of news coming to them and frankly a narrative that they are the problem, right? That they're the problem with society. They're what is making the army weak, right? Or they are what is, and making the government inefficient, right? How can they not revert to a psychological situation of shame or of thinking that indeed they are weak people or they are lesser people, How can you protect yourself if you are in an environment where really the rhetoric is kind of sending you back to where you were in middle school when you were feeling shameful of your sexual orientation or gender identity?
Oh, it's a great question. I think again, the world we're in right now is one where you have some people who are truly trying to vilify whole communities of people for whatever reasons. We could look back in history and find many examples of when that's happened with some pretty dire consequences. And so it's, the vilification is very real. And, what I would say to the LGBTQ community is, when you start basing your worth on what strangers are saying, Elon Musk and others, but strangers to you, right? who don't know you, who don't know your values, who don't know your strength, who don't know your courage, who don't know anything about you, but they're choosing to vilify a group of people. When you base your own self-worth on that, you go down a pretty dangerous path pretty quickly. And so my counsel would be, and it sounds overly simplistic, and I don't mean it to be, it's hard in our world right now with so many things coming at us, but my counsel is truly, don't read the negative tweets. And there's a lot of them out there. We can't shield ourselves from all of it. But when you start going down that path, it's almost impossible not to become enraged, right? At the rhetoric that's coming at you and things that people are saying based upon nothing. And it's so hard not to feel rage and not to go back to a place of shame. And I think the best thing for our mental health is to not put ourselves, at least intentionally, in positions where we are tempted to base our self-worth on the rhetoric of strangers, who are, it's smoke from another fire, whatever the other fire is, but they don't know you, me, right? They're just talking. And so I think we've got to have a filter for ourselves, for our own mental health and our own mental well-being, to say, my self-worth has to be based on who I am as a person and the relationships that I build and the value that I add in this world. And again, it's much easier said than done. But I think about what do we all have agency over? Where do we have control? We have control over, to some extent, what we choose to read, the feeds that we choose to be a part of, the things that we choose to internalize. Unfortunately, we don't have control over some of the decisions that are made, right? As we're seeing play out over these past 6 to 8 weeks, there's a lot that we cannot control, but we can control who we choose to let into our space and what rhetoric now, I don't suggest that we put our heads in the sand. I mean, it's important to know what's going on out there, right? Because there is a lot of dangerous stuff being said. So I don't want to suggest, only watch the Disney Channel and, don't ever read the news. But be careful about the feeds that you really let yourself absorb.
Well, I love that, and I love also everything you say about self-worth. What always struck me as I meet LGBT board member and aspiring board member is the high quality that they have. Those are people that have gone through so much to get to the point that they are, that very often it's actually baffling to see how qualified they are to be in the room, even though now the narrative is that those are people that are not qualified and do not deserve to be there. The reality is that they tend to be extremely qualified. But what also struck me, is that over the past few years is to always see that there is also some level of self-doubt. And I've observed that with women too, right? Is this thing that there is a part of ourselves that is always, even when we get to the top, that is always asking ourselves, well, do I deserve to be that? Because we carry that burden of shame. And so I love what you say, which is, well, focus on what you do, what are your values, the track record that you have, instead of the rhetoric about you that you may hear outside. And I hope that, frankly, that worth is what will make us bridge that representation gap we spoke today. Well, look, we are at the end of our programming. I wanted to thank you very much, Beth, Jim, and Vanessa for being here. Beth giving us the best advice on how to navigate this really strange context, and Jim sharing your personal experience that meant a lot, and Vanessa giving us a bit of a flavor of the human and psychological dimension of our journey. I really appreciate that. Thank you to the NACD Northern California for organizing and sticking with that LGBT cohort programming, and thank you to Cooley and RHR International for sponsoring the program. And I hope we have the opportunity to have more conversation like this one, and I see you all very soon.